Okay, so let's move down the cascade from chromosomal sex to gonadal sex. As we recall from Chapter 2, gonads are the generic term for ovaries and testicles, right? So gonadal sex is the chromosomes determine how your gonads migrate into either testicles or ovaries while you're in the womb. Typically, the chromosome will determine, for example, if you have a Y chromosome present, it'll cause those gonads to change into testicles over the course of a few weeks and then descend out of the body and like that by birth. In the absence of testosterone or in a testosterone insensitive baby, those gonads will take on the pattern of an ovary. If the person is XY and they are insensitive to testosterone, or they didn't make any testosterone, what looks like an ovary is actually going to stay just an undifferentiated gonad. It's not going to contain sperm, it's not going to contain eggs, it's just undifferentiated. In a person who has XX pattern, and that's why they're lacking testosterone, then it develops into an ovary. If you have a person who has an XX pattern and for some reason testosterone is added, it can cause what looks like testicles to develop, but in fact they're going to stay gonads. So if the gonad doesn't match your actual chromosomal sex, it won't function correctly. It won't release the sex gametes that it's supposed to. Okay. So what does gonadal sex do? It leads to our hormonal sex. So by making either testes or ovaries, that's going to set this person up for exposure to testosterone once they reach puberty, or exposure to, well, the absence of testosterone, and then ultimately the exposure to estrogen and progesterone that'll come out of the ovaries. So the presence of testes throughout the rest of pregnancy and then again at puberty is going to cause the release of androgens. So here we have a fetus across the pattern of testosterone levels in a fetus across gestation, and you see the testes are created around the 9th week after conception. So you see the testes start to produce androgens, and then you can detect in that fetus the presence of testosterone peaking around 16 weeks gestation, and then it drops off. It's done its job, and so it drops off, and it actually has a small peak again after birth, but pretty much stays dormant until puberty. So the XY will cause the release of androgens, which will give us this hormonal profile over the course of gestation, whereas for females, over the course of gestation, typically you're not going to have that peak of testosterone. Now I say typically because stuff can happen and a female might be exposed to testosterone also. So we'll talk about that in another segment. So what hormones do during gestation, we think, is contribute to masculinization of the brain or feminization of the brain. So here we have a picture of a composite of a bunch of different brain activity measurements. These are functional MRIs. And with a functional MRI, a computer colorizes different areas that are using lots of blood. So in the places where it's red and moving on into yellow, that's where the women have larger volumes. And where it's blue and moving off into the sort of light blue whitish, that's where the men have larger volumes. And so on average across a number of different males and females who were tested, you can see that on average women have bigger frontal lobes. That's the two brains on the top left are looking upward, and the one on the far left, we're looking at it from the top of its head, and on the one that's in the middle of the top, we're looking at it up from below. So you can see more red in the frontal lobes of the female. They are looking up. You can see more activity in the male, or larger volumes in the male. In the top left panel, you see a big, bright blue spot in the left frontal lobe, which is an area that has to do with spatial reasoning and putting things together in a logical sequence and things like that. You also see a nice bright blue area on the right side of the brain in what we call the parietal lobe, and that's an area that's really responsive to the left side of the body. typically processes movement. So in the middle panel on the top row, you see a lot of blue activity, like on the underside of the brain. So on the undersides of the cortex, you see a lot of volume for the males. And then on the picture that's in the top right, we're looking at it from, we are on this person's left side, and we're looking at like the middle of their brain. So you see a lot of blue in the back of that brain and in the lower structures and on the center of the brain, and then that little spot that we were already talking about in the left front. So that's, I mean, we don't really know what all these different areas do for sure. So when we see that there's more brain matter in certain areas of the male brain and more brain matter in certain areas of the female brain, we can't point at an area and say, well, this is why women can visualize their medicine chest and tell a person exactly where the aspirin bottle is without having to look. We can't find that spot, right? It's not necessarily easy to detect, but we can tell you about sort of themes that might be explained as a function of males typically having more brain matter in this area and females typically having more brain matter in that area. Now, I keep using words like average and typical and things like that because I could not, no matter what you look like or what stereotypes I might want to invoke, if I looked at you, I would not be able to tell you whether you're good at reading maps or whether you would like to pick up babies or any of these sort of stereotyped behaviors. I can't tell you for an individual what anybody likes, dislikes, what their talents are, anything like that. All we can say is that on average, males have more brain matter devoted to certain kinds of tasks, and females have more brain matter devoted to other kinds of tasks. And we're really at the very baby, level of trying to understand this stuff, by the way. Seeing a brain scan like this looks really important and meaningful, but we're just really starting to understand that, there are sex differences on average between males and females, and then to try and figure out what it means, when they happened, things like that. The basic model right now is that during gestation, a lot of this stuff happens, and that it happens just as a function of chromosomes leading to your gonads releasing certain kinds of hormones that then cause, different sized areas in the brain. But some of this stuff's going to happen after birth too. These are adult brains that were scanned, so we're not exactly sure if some of these things are habits, if they were socialized, things like that. Okay, now here's another version. Now I gave you a picture of the brain with stuff labeled in the bottom part just so you can kind of get oriented. It's facing the same direction as the picture and so on. Here's a different study, and what they are showing us is that, for example, the corpus callosum, which in my bottom panel is not labeled. If you look at my bottom panel, you see the thing that's baby blue that's labeled the hippocampus? See how it has like that tube that goes around the top, and then it has like that little other baby blue tube is like smaller and underneath. The thing that's between those two tubes that looks almost like solid pink in the bottom panel, that's the corpus callosum. And it's a band of fibers that allows the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. Study after study has shown that females have bigger, that is longer corpus callosa than males, and that they are more densely packed with fibers. Now, there have been all sorts of hypotheses trying to figure out what that actually means for our behaviors, our abilities, things like that. One big factor is that females can share information between their two hemispheres much more rapidly. The right hemisphere of our brains tends to handle spatial tasks. If you're playing chess, for example, your right hemisphere will be really lit up as it's trying to visualize where the pieces are and things like that. Unless you're me, and I don't know how to play chess very well, and so I spend my time playing chess thinking verbal thoughts. I don't really think about the spatial aspects. I just sit there going, well, where's my horsey guy? How's he allowed to move? I don't really know how to play. And so for me, it's a very verbal game. As I'm asking questions, I'm very confused. But if you know how to play chess and you just can kind of play instinctually, you're probably using your right hemisphere. The left hemisphere of your brain is the part that handles, for about 99% of us, it handles language. We have specialized structures for the production and the understanding of language. And then it handles, how do I say, like, I'm really, really hesitant to use words like logic, because a lot of times people think logic means intelligence, and that's not what we mean. When we say logic, it's like putting together elements of information and drawing conclusions from those elements. So like scientific reasoning would be another way that we would possibly describe it. So that happens on the left hemisphere. So for women, having a bigger corpus callosum, it can be a huge benefit. You can share information back and forth, but it also can be a deficit. It can slow down processing so that while trying to do what should be an entirely spatial task, women oftentimes will be slower because they're thinking verbal thoughts about the spatial task. Men oftentimes will just let their right hemisphere take care of the problem, and they'll have their solution much more quickly. A great example of that is they've had races across lots of different male-female pairs to stack objects into a trunk. And men tend to do it faster, not because they're stronger or any of those things. It's because they can visualize the space that's available and the objects that need to go into it more quickly, and they can just accomplish the task much more quickly. That may be attributable to the fact that the right hemisphere can just be left to do its own thing without interference from the left hemisphere when you have a smaller corpus callosum. These are possible explanations, but we are at the very beginning of these areas, and so we really don't know. These are things that people have asserted. Now, there are areas that are bigger in the male brain. You see larger volumes underneath the corpus callosum, and so in that area, males have more material that, brain matter that's available to process information. So there appears to be pretty significant sex differences in the average way that the average male brain versus the average female brain is structured. And we think that that's a function of hormones. So now I have a little comedy piece linked here where the man's talking about males versus females, and he has a really funny take on it. It's pretty stereotyping, and it's one of those things that we can't say for an individual woman whether she can play chess like a master. We can't say for an individual man whether he can empathize with someone else's feelings. We can't say that for individuals. All we can say is that on average we see differences. Now, here's a picture that depicts how hormones change across up until through adolescence, really. And so you see that in utero, you see that spike of testosterone in the blue area. Then you see in babies between birth and about 6 months of age, they all have like this little tiny, they call it mini puberty, where you get some of your estrogen if you're female, some of your testosterone if you're male. Then you see through the prepubescent period of childhood really not really noticeable differences between males and females as far as hormone patterns. If you take an average boy child and an average male child, and I just said boy and male, I'm pretty sure I meant to say boy and girl, but if you take two people of different sexes who haven't yet reached puberty, who are more than 6 months old, and you test their blood, you probably would have a great deal of difficulty finding any real difference in their hormone patterns. But then you start to enter pre-puberty, and you start to see the addition of hormones. And so suddenly at puberty, for both males and females, they enter at different ages. We'll talk about that later. But suddenly you'll get the development of testosterone in the male, and suddenly you'll see the appearance of estrogen and progesterone in the female. So it goes from pretty much nothing to the onset of puberty, and now we get these changes. And with those changes, we assume that there's sort of a further development of the brain structures that are now suddenly awash in hormones. Okay, before I talk about that, I wanted to mention one little thing, and it's just something to think about. Again, these are things that psychologists are talking about right now that we didn't used to talk about 5 years ago. But one thing that is really, really important is that during childhood, like I said, there really is this quiescence of hormones. And so if you have a child who hasn't yet begun puberty, who's expressing interest in being the other sex, some psychologists advocate delaying onset of puberty to buy time for the child to figure out, how they identify and things like that. Others recommend not interfering with the hormone pattern because a lot of times with the addition of the natural hormones, the decision becomes really clear. So it's one of those things that is very, very difficult for parents who are trying to raise children to decide what to do, if anything, if their children display any kind of, inkling towards, gender dysphoria or gender nonconformity, or however you want to phrase it. It's really a tough choice. And so parents who are going through that need to take it very, very seriously and realize this might be something that would change with the addition of the normal puberty hormones that are probably going to occur. It might become something that is going to become even more profoundly sure after puberty. And you don't really know for a child how puberty is going to affect the way that their brain is functioning. So we're going to talk about puberty in another chapter, but I just sort of want to introduce that issue since we're talking about gender, that kids with their low levels of hormones may be functioning differently than they're going to one way or another after puberty. So important things. So another issue with hormonal sex, and I'm sorry if I'm going long, but I just kind of want to get hormonal sex done with all in one fell swoop here. Another issue is that we're assuming that if you have a Y chromosome, you should be having testosterone present in the womb and after puberty, and we're assuming that if you don't have a Y chromosome, then you shouldn't be having testosterone present. Well, there's a disorder called congenital adrenal hyperplasia that causes the HPA axis that I described earlier to expose an XX baby to a bath of testosterone. Now, it's called congenital adrenal hyperplasia because it's not necessarily genetic. It's not something that you inherit. It's something that happens in the womb for one reason or another. So the female fetus gets bathed in testosterone, and if it happens during the development of the sex organs, it can masculinize the sex organs. If it happens later, it could masculinize the brain. Androgen insensitivity syndrome is the thing that might happen for a male baby, a male fetus, who is got the X and the Y, but for some reason is insensitive to the androgens that are being secreted by his body. And so his usually it's going to happen after the development of the sex organs. That would be partial androgen insensitivity syndrome. Sometimes it's complete. So it happens even before the sex organs develop. And so you may end up with feminized sex organs, so feminized that they literally, you could not tell that those aren't female sex organs. The only way that you can tell is that actually the what look like ovaries are actually gonads. So it could be complete, or it could be that the androgen insensitivity happened later in pregnancy, and so the male fetus didn't get the masculinization of the brain. It could happen even later at puberty, when it's time for all the effects of testosterone and the body is just not sensitive to androgen anymore, and so the masculinization, the growth of beard, build up of muscle mass, all that stuff that typically happens with puberty is absent. So there's different degrees of androgen sensitivity. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia can affect at different times during gestation, and sometimes during gestation it wouldn't have any effect at all. There's no way that you'd even notice. And other times it can masculinize the genitals or just masculinize the brain. So hormonal sex can be affected at several points. Okay, so that's enough on that. Let's go ahead and take a break, and then in the next segment we'll talk about gender identity.